Welcome to Asake Online. My name is Brighton. This is Know Your Right, a show that's to look at the Zimbabwean Constitution as well as the Bill of Rights. So over the past weeks, we've been talking to lawyers, MPs, as well as students on the issues of the constitutional amendments in Zimbabwe. But one voice that's been missing in this conversation has been that of the youth. Today on the show, I'm joined by Thabo, Dube, the founder and director of Youth Trust. Thabo, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Brighton. Thank you for having me.
Right, Thabo, why are we amending the Constitution before aligning the laws to the Constitution?
I think, Brighton, it's a question that we've had. Sadly, we would laugh about it or joke about it as a country, but that's a very critical question. And I think the biggest problem that we see is that of us trying to amend a constitution that we haven't fully implemented as a way of trying to reverse the gains that were made through the 2013 constitution, where we tried to decongest or tried to limit the powers of the president, tried to establish mechanisms for our democracy and promote accountability. So now we, for example, maybe to answer your question in summary, before clauses such as maybe the running mate clause and other clauses come into effect, we've already decided as a country, and maybe I'll explain later what that means, that we want to amend, we want to do away with that. So I think it's a question of political expediency by the ruling party, which has a 2/3 majority. They know they can push the constitutional amendment, whether we want to or not. So that's more or less it, yeah.
A closer look at the Zimbabwean Constitution, do you think there's constitutionalism in the Constitution of Zimbabwe?
I think we exist in a country which is largely what I usually call a neo-patrimonial society, where you rule by law, but you don't allow for rule of law, where the constitution, and we have a culture of a lot of amendments. You'd know the COPAC 2013 constitution is titled Amendment number 20. And if you go back to those amendments, you'd see that it was there were amendments to try and entrench power, to try and centralize power within a certain political party. So we are going towards constitutionalism. I don't believe that constitutionalism is an event. It's a process, and we need to strengthen our processes and that culture. But I wouldn't say we are a constitutional democracy. We aspire to be one, and we are striving towards that. But currently, no. We have a government that rules by law, and that will continue doing that unless checked.
When it comes to participation and also consultations, we've seen the COPAC consulting people and drafting this constitution. We've seen them going different places, consulting people on their views about this constitution. But when it comes to public hearings now, people are given 2 hours, people are given 30 minutes, a batch of the 50 people going in.
Yeah.
So where is the issue of consultation now in these public hearings?
Yeah, I think I would personally advocate for us trying to push a critical amendment, that of making constitutional amendments a bit harder. Like you rightly said, the COPAC constitution was internationally acclaimed. A lot of people, even locally, there was a lot of buy-in, more so because the process was more engaging. But now with constitutional amendment number 2, like I said, it's a case of expediency. We are seeking to amend the constitution during the COVID-19 lockdown, which number 1 limits the ability of citizens to be able to travel to these consultative spots. And like you said, the time frame, because of COVID regulations, from my experience, we more or less had 30 minutes. And the chairperson of the said parliamentary portfolio committee indicated that, you know what, we've been doing this, and if a certain view has already been said, we would prefer that people don't speak to it. To me, it was an onslaught against the expressions that would have otherwise been raised by people. For example, there is a young lady who stood up, identified herself with Zesni, And the chairperson said, oh, well, we've had submissions from ZESNI. You guys should just consolidate your views into a document and submit. So in essence, she was silenced. This speaks to how by right consultations are low order type of engagement processes. We want to hear your views, but we're not necessarily obliged to take them. So I think there's need for us to make constitutional amendments harder and quite possibly take each and every amendment process through a national referendum where people are sensitized on what the amendment is all about. People are given time to be able to come up with positions in terms of, do we vote yes or do we vote no, or do we say go back and redraft and relook at the amendment so that we can clearly engage. Because I think that's what our downfall would be. It was too short a process, and we might end up having an amendment that does not seek to address the needs of the people, but it will only address the elites who are pushing for it.
So as Yield, you work well with young people from different suburbs in Bulawayo. But now, these hearings were held in town, in the CBD.
Yeah.
Transport problems from the suburbs to town.
Yeah.
So how did Yield address those issues?
So through our funding partners, we tried to mobilize. We mobilized 25 youths who we supported with transport allowance to try and have them come through. But you put it rightly that for Bulawayo is a metropolitan province. We would have expected Parliament of Zimbabwe to have considered having different centers for these consultations so that it would be easily accessible. Not every young person who would have wanted to express themselves could access the venue because of lockdown restrictions as well, because of transport problems as well. And you know how I'm told there's a judicial ruling that said, well, we can't stop the public hearings. If you don't feel safe or secure to go to the public hearings, you might as well submit hand over a written submission, which means at most it's too elitist. We end up excluding the views of young people, more so because young people are the future. So we need to get more young people accessing these centers of engagement.
Now let's talk about the youth participation in these public hearings. You attended the public hearing on Tuesday, Wednesday.
Yes.
How was it like? Did youth participate? Did youth attend? How was it like?
Young people indeed attended. We witnessed a long winding queue at Thabo Hotel, and we mostly had more women and more women attending, and that's a plus on our part as a city. And I am quite certain that a couple of young people from the session that I went in, young people indeed stood up and made their submissions. But however, like I was saying, from the reading of the group, we have a mixed position as maybe civil society or as the public in terms of whether we're accepting the amendment or not. Because people were nitpicking against clauses. People were saying, well, we haven't implemented. Why do we need to amend something that we haven't fully implemented? So it speaks to how our participation is always going to be limited by time and by the information that we have. We needed more time to be sensitized, to discuss these things as young people, quite possibly come up with a position and then engage Parliament.
But also, earlier on, you spoke about the constitutional literacy in Zimbabwe.
Yeah.
Do the young people know more about the Constitution before you go to these amendments? Do they know about the Constitution of Zimbabwe?
I should applaud you and your show to say, know your rights. I know for a fact the Yet compendium on youth, the British Council report on youth as well, point to the fact that young people are not as constitutionally literate as we think they are. There are a couple of number of reasons why that may be the case. Many times people throw the word that youth are apathetic, but I think young people are disenfranchised, disengaged, and alienated from all these spaces. You have adults who would otherwise not share a constitution or don't think discussing constitutional matters with their children is a plus, which is largely because of the nature of our politics and it's quite unfortunate. So there's a need for us to make sure we try and raise the constitutional literacy of young people and promote the dissemination of the constitution in various languages. It's resource heavy, but it's something that's necessary.
Now let's pick some of the provisions of the amendments. Now, the youth quota system. 10 seats to be given to youths in National Assembly, 1 per province. Care to comment on that?
As a young person, I think any form of, there are merits and demerits to any form of affirmative action. But my biggest worry is not in the number of seats, but in the fact that we are not addressing the root cause of why young people are not gaining entry into public office. So I think if any amendment seeks to address that challenge of why we don't have as many women, why we don't have as many people with disabilities or young people going into politics and assuming public office, we need to look at how do we deal with the violence, how do we deal with political financing, and so forth. So I think 10 is piecemeal, and it could be a plus in that we might have some level of representation, but that's limited to youth in political parties. You have young people who would otherwise not be able to access those seats because you are not a member of a political party, you are an independent, and you're not guaranteed a seat by virtue of that. So if I were to vote based on the youth quota system, I would reject the amendment and say, well, it's not addressing the causes for youth disengagement or youth alienation from public office. Yeah.
So, in on view, how many numbers is enough for young people to be given National Assembly?
I think based on the fact that, for example, young people, I would have to cross-check my statistics. So approximately young people are 75% of the national population and plus or minus 40% of the electorate. I think numbers reflective of those statistical figures would be better. 40% for youths, or finding a more systematic way of ensuring that youths are represented at all levels. For example, why don't we have youth ministers being deputies across the board, ensuring that if Thabo doesn't make it as a full minister, at least there should be a mechanism of making sure that he's a deputy minister. Why don't we have young people assuming positions of leadership? It's not only limited to being members of parliament. In political parties, youths are limited to youth leagues, and you're told, no, you're not there yet, you're not an adult yet for you to assume these offices. So it's not necessarily a number issue, but I think if I were to suggest a number, I think 40%, anything in that region would be okay.
But also, we've been having this conversation at different spaces about the issue of tokenism in young people and also women sometimes.
Yeah.
So giving them seats, free seats, codes, isn't this tokenism? How are we empowering women and young people through tokenism?
Well, one could say it's tokenistic, but I would personally say even if it were tokenistic, it's still a plus in that we are at least getting somewhere. I would like to think the leaders or the powers that we are not doing us a favor. It is an outcome of consistent advocacy as to saying young people are not represented in parliament, that we now have 10 seats to talk about. We have constantly been in the trenches to say we need more youth representation. So we have to take it a step at a time. I suppose it's going to be cumulative or incremental as time goes. So it might be tokenistic to some, it might be some form of affirmative action, and other cadres in the discourse would suggest that it disempowers you when you go into a position through affirmative action. It's as if you were not good enough. I don't think young people are not good enough. I think there are structural issues that prohibit us becoming members of parliament and cabinet ministers, or even assuming the office of president. Yeah.
Let's look at the role of the public protector now vis-a-vis the Human Rights Commission. Some say it's taking away the role of the Human Rights Commission by putting the public protector. What's your view?
Yeah, my view really is, firstly, I think it's again an onslaught on the institutions that are supposed to support the democracy that we strive to be as a country. In that if you read the amendment, it speaks to how the public protector will focus on corruption and maladministration. So the attempt is to move corruption and maladministration from the human rights framework, take it away from that whole, the moral imperative of saying corruption kills, corruption promotes or causes poverty. And you want to create a parallel structure instead of strengthening the Zimbabwe Human Rights Commission. So if we were to accept it, if we were to accept that we need a public protector, I would argue that that public protector has to be subservient to the Human Rights Commission, has to be within the commission. If they want to make an office within the commission, it's okay. But to create a separate institution is more or less drawing circles. We're not going anywhere. We need to be promoting the institutions that are there and have them fight corruption from the human rights-based framework to say, we have COVID gate. How many people have died, or how many rights were affected by the scandal that we have, or the corruption that exists, so that we can galvanize more and indeed seek to address that more strongly.
During the public hearings, there was much debate about the running mate as well as the issue of judges. So now, removing the running mate and also having judges being appointed by the president, that's giving power to one institution. What's the problem of giving power to the executive?
The biggest problem is that politicians are not angels. They are not the best people to live unchecked. We saw this during the Mugabe regime, where you had the one center of power ideology. So when you take away the running mates, basically, I think even Brighton, we need to consider why we need 2 vice presidents as a country. We are 15 million or so. 2 vice presidents is not necessarily the right way to go. Fine, there are arguments of how we are trying to balance the tribal politics, but that's again addressing the symptoms, not the causes. So back to running mate. Running mates allowed for us as a country to elect a vice president and develop a succession matrix. We would at least know by law to say the vice president that was voted for by people who has the mandate from the electorate is so and so, and would assume they take up office. Now, when you have a vice president who serves at the pleasure of the president, it means they are bound not to even hold the president to account. There's no check and balance mechanism within the executive. A president who can appoint senior members of the judiciary, extend their tenure without much public inquiry or public scrutiny, is again a president who's trying to build a circle of patronage, people who serve, people who are bound to be loyal to you because they know, for example, if I was a senior judge, maybe in the Supreme Court, I would know I'm turning 70, I'm supposed to be stepping down or retiring. But for me to get more and continue in the gravy train, I have to suck up. I have to
But someone
be
can argue and
conscious.
say the judges mature with time, just like wine.
See, on the judges issue, I wrote a position paper or a submission on that to say the problem is the law or the constitution says you are only considered for senior level positions when you're 40, right? A young person ceases to be young at 35, according to the law. There's a gap, a 5-year gap. I'm a lawyer. I mature with time. We should be reducing the age of minimum qualification to even 30 to say, if Brighton is a brilliant lawyer and has all the characteristics of being a judge, let's not limit him to being a magistrate as well. He can rise. And if we want to extend, we should really consider why would we want to extend. I know the law already provides for the fact that if you turn 70 and you still had 4 or 5 cases, you can still serve those cases out and retire. So it's not consistent with how other civil servants are being treated, and why do we want to be creating this culture within the judiciary, which is critical in terms of holding the executive to account. Yeah.
So Thabo, from here, we've done the public hearings. From here, where to?
Well, I am sure the parliamentary portfolio committee should be consolidating the views of the people and publishing a report. with the hope is that they would take into consideration what the people have been saying. But like I said earlier on, because of the political expediency, based on the fact that the ruling party has 2/3 majority, and based on the fact that the constitution, the current constitution, does not make a provision, it only makes a provision for a national referendum for Chapter 4, the Bill of Rights, and issues of agricultural land. But we are undermining we are not taking into consideration the fact that all these other appointments, according to Amendment number 2, are interrelated. They deliberately affect the Bill of Rights. For example, if you have a president who we can't hold to account, if we have a president who will appoint judges, who appoint a prosecutor, who can appoint or fire a vice president, this then would affect some of our rights. So I think, and I hope that the parliament the portfolio committee will take into consideration the views of the people and submit these to the powers that be. And I think as a political party, the ruling party should also take into consideration the views that the people are saying. Because I don't necessarily think all their votes come from their political party members. They come also from the public. And as a ruling party, you don't only represent your own political interests, but you take into account the diverse interests that might be there from the public.
I want to speak about the issue of information gap. People don't have information about the constitutional amendment or even the constitution itself.
Yeah.
So what is the role of the CSOs? What's the role of the organization in terms of giving information to the public?
I think as CSOs, we need to step up in terms of pushing constitutional literacy. Well, I think many times we have a weakness of citing resource constraints and so forth. I don't necessarily think it's resource heavy to host, say, constitutional clinics, be it online, or create a space, avail a space and say, come, or mobilize lawyers, or not have the discussion to be elitist. We'll discuss as young people, we'll discuss as CSOs on what the Constitution says, what it means, what are the areas of our recourse. So as an organization, we are looking into trying to promote constitutional literacy. We're trying to develop a platform where young people should be able to access information in their own language, in a language that they would understand, on the Constitution, with the hope that this starts or this supports the cause of constitutional literacy. Because already, I know a couple of young people said, well, why we have constitutional amendment number 2 happening. What was constitutional amendment number 1 about? And it's still new. It's 7 years old. You'd think 7 is not much, but young people should be literate. It's not only something that we should do because CSOs or other actors are pushing, but as a citizen, if you understand as a young person that you're a citizen, and the Constitution guides your relationship with the state and how you relate with other people. Personally, we should be able to have that self-drive to say, let me read through the Constitution. If you don't understand, seek that information.
Yeah. Thabo, as we wrap up our conversation, we always hear that people say, Constitutional Map is a rich document, it's a well-written piece of document. What's in your heart when it comes to the Constitution of Zimbabwe?
Well, I think I'm still studying it, and from the initial impressions that I have in my heart, I think indeed it captures our aspirations as a country, but because the Constitution was more, I've always called it a negotiated document, just like most constitutions are world over. It was a negotiated document between political elites, and or there are loopholes, there are areas that we could indeed try and fine-tune, but it's a good step in the right direction. So personally, I would say we shouldn't amend it willy-nilly. We should try and implement it as much as possible, align our laws to ensure that they are consistent and they promote the constitution that we currently have.
Thabo, thank you so much for joining us. Let's hope you enjoyed the show. We've been watching Know Your Right as we're discussing the public hearings that were held in Bulawayo this past week. Please do enjoy the show and follow us on Twitter at ZW. Follow them on Twitter at YieldTrustZW and follow me on Twitter at The Whole Bfactor. #Masa.